Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we follow a road that runs from the Sahara to the Somme, tracing the story of the French Army of Africa as it marched from the outposts of the Empire and into the furnace of trench warfare. With the aid of French Army expert James Taub, we'll examine the nature of this unique force, where it came from, how it was organised, and how it fought on the Western Front and beyond. Well, hello again, James. Just you and I on the podcast today again. Dan's still away on his travels, but that gives us another great opportunity to continue our discussion that we began last week looking at the French colonial army, to discuss other aspects of the French military in the First World War, and particularly the colonial forces that, of course, fought very intensely on the Western Front and indeed beyond. We often see them portrayed in images, in art and so forth, but actually getting a chance to dive deep into this subject with you, James, is a really fascinating exploration. And last week we dealt with the French colonial army, and you were at pains last week to emphasise the French colonial army is not the Army of Africa. And of course that left the listeners with a big question. So what is the Army of Africa? So James, can you give us a quick summary? What is the difference, or what are the key differences between the Army of Africa and the French colonial army?
Absolutely. The French Army of Africa, absolutely fascinating. And I would argue probably a group of soldiers that are more understood in the English-speaking world than potentially even the regular metropolitan French army. They're the embodiment of that 19th, early 20th century idea of the French Empire and its soldiers. So just very quickly to break down the difference between them and the colonial army, in the 1830s, the French government under Charles X, and then followed by Louis Philippe, invade Algeria. And it is fought over and slowly but surely conquered in these horrible and really brutal campaigns where you see mass atrocities on both sides through the rest of the 19th century. France considers Algeria as part of the metropole. So Algeria is a department of France. They have an army corps. The Army of Africa becomes the 19th Army Corps in the French army. So it is part of the metropolitan French army. That is the big difference between them and the colonial troops, which we covered in a previous episode. Now, they're also considered really among the elite of the French metropolitan army, partially because they're so exotic, and partially because they fight everywhere throughout the campaigns of the 19th century. And in the English-speaking world and in the rest of the world, as we just said, they're the embodiment of the elite French soldier because they are the ones that most English-speaking soldiers are exposed to and see. You have newspaper reports from the conquest of Algeria of units like the Zouaves, who are originally recruited from the Zoazua tribe of the mountains of Algeria. Eventually, the French say you have to be French to serve in this unit. You have to be a French citizen, and they force out the native soldiers into a unit known as the Tirailleurs Algériens, the Algerian Tirailleurs. The Zouaves and the Tirailleurs, and they're exotic, what are called sarouel, they're the big baggy pants, and Chechia, they're not fezzes, though in English we'd probably call them a fez, stand out, and they're seen in newspaper accounts in the 1830s, 1840s, and in the Crimean War, they're seen in action by British soldiers who write home. And it seems when you read English accounts of the Crimean War, it's always about the Zouaves because they're so exotic. The painting of them storming the Malakoff at Sebastopol or scaling the heights at Alma really sticks out as this distinct story. In the United States, they actually copy the Zouaves during the American Civil War, and you see units of Americans on both sides, North and South, fighting during the American Civil War, though they don't really embody the idea of light infantry tactics that the Zouaves are known to operate on. Mainly it's the uniform. It would be like if a different country recruited their own version of the SAS today. It's like, that's cool, and they're elite, but they don't really take in the ethos and the ideas of what they're supposed to be doing. And then you see all this exposure to these guys in the 19th century. Then you see them campaign actively in Africa, as well as being sent abroad to French campaigns in Indochina, into the Far East, to French campaigns in Mexico, to French campaigns all over the world. So these are some of the most experienced regiments in the French army when World War I breaks out in 1914. And slightly different in their organization than the rest of the metropolitan French army. Many of the Zouaves and a large part of the European soldiers in the Tirailleurs, you will see European-born soldiers and soldiers of European descent, and especially officers in the Tirailleurs, are professional soldiers. They are not only doing their mandatory 3 years of military service, but they're volunteering to serve on active campaign outside of France, additionally, for their career. So they are, in a large part, very, very professional and experienced. And they'll have campaigned in the years leading up to 1914 in places like Morocco, in places like Madagascar, and as well in southern Algeria and even Tunisia. So these are soldiers that have a lot of different experience. They are both native-born, Algerian, Moroccan as well, as we'll see. The Kingdom of Morocco is a protectorate, really by force, of France in 1914, as well as Tunisian. And European soldiers who are either descendants of European colonists living in North Africa or recruits from the metropole of France. And they also do have, I should note, reserve battalions that are permanently stationed in France. So a lot of the first units of North African Zouaves that you see in action in the fall of 1914, late summer, early fall of 1914, are actually Parisians. And Saint Denis in northern Paris are reserve battalions of Zouaves who mobilize as soon as the war begins. So it is an interesting group of soldiers, and the elite and most experienced. And hopefully our listeners can tell how excited I am about this topic, because I said this would be very, very short, and I think I just went for maybe 7 minutes.
There's a lot to cover, James, and I'm glad you mentioned the Zouaves in the American Civil War, because I think that really emphasizes something about how iconic the Zouaves are in the English-speaking world, that there are regiments of Zouaves formed by both the North and the South in the US Civil War and go into action in this, they're trying to mimic the uniforms, in some cases quite accurately mimic the uniforms, in other cases sort of quite broad interpretations of what a Zouave might look like. Colourful with red seems to be the broad line. And even in Britain as well, even though Britain and France have a lot of tensions, a lot of doubts in the late 19th century, it's not until the early 20th that relations improve. The Zouaves are almost, whenever you see an illustration in British popular press, in British pictorial series or anything like that, whenever they are illustrating the French army, there'll be French line regiments and there'll be Zouaves. It's guaranteed. And that's quite interesting, because you don't really see quite the same in how the British army portrays itself. You'll have lots of British units, obviously lots of grand formal uniforms. You might have the Indian army portrayed with its unusual uniforms as well. But the idea that the Zouaves are inseparable from the French army, I think, is really, really clearly wed into certainly the British and the American mind prior to the First World War. They're that iconic. And as you say, part of the reason they're iconic is they fight everywhere. These are the sort of colonial shock troops of the French army. They're a bit like, we talked a little bit about the distinction between colonial and metropolitan last week, but they can be called upon to go anywhere, fight anywhere, do anything. And it reminds me a little bit of the supposed motto of the British Army in 1914, which is, we'll do it, what is it? And that seems to sort of fit the Army of Africa a little bit as well. But you made the point, James, that the Zouaves are a mixture of French-born, white, French living in Algeria and so forth, as well as native, indigenous Algerians too. So we've got Algerians, got Moroccans, Tunisians and so on. How are they recruited? Is there a pattern for recruitment here? How are they recruited? What kind of training do they go through? Is it different from the rest of the French army? Is national service applied in the way that it is in mainland France? Or how does it all work?
So I have to jump in a little bit, and we have to differentiate here that for all of these units in the French army, infantry and cavalry, the combat arms, there are separations for French citizens and native-born, indigenous, what they would use, this is the term they would use at the time, soldiers. So to be a Zouave, which is the infantry of the Army of Africa for the most part, you are of European descent. So very, very, very few native-born soldiers are allowed in. You have to be a French citizen. And at that time, with the idea of laïcité, and which is the French version of separation of church and state, basically no religion in government, and that includes people working in the government, especially under the Third Republic. Islam isn't completely compatible with that. And there's an idea in the French government as to the potentially untrustworthy higher allegiance to Islam than to France, which is something that they really, really struggle with, and it is heavily debated at the time and is still debated to this day, as we know. But the Zouaves are overwhelmingly, and I would even say 99.9% European descent. So it is still a segregated group of soldiers. You have to be a French citizen. The one major exception you do see in the Zouaves is, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War in the early 1870s, you have a decree known as the Crémieux Decree, which sees North African Jews given French citizenship. So a large proportion of the French Jewish community in North Africa, it's actually about, and don't quote me on this, I'm in ballpark in here. I actually have it in a different PowerPoint. It is 23% of all French Jews in World War I serve in the Zouaves. Large proportion of that population, and that goes to proving their Frenchness, is by serving in a unit where you have to be legally French to serve in these units. The polar opposite of the Zouaves, on the other side, would be the Tirailleurs Algériens. And so that is going to be predominantly native-born soldiers with white NCOs and officers, though indigenous soldiers could become non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers, though, again, you have to become a French citizen. And there's absolutely favoritism towards European soldiers for that. The recruitment of both of those, especially the Zouaves, are going to look the same as it will in metropolitan France. Originally, the tirailleurs rely heavily on voluntary recruitment. And voluntary should really be given in a parentheses, just like we talked about with soldiers from sub-Saharan Africa last week. But there are still very much these tribal affiliations, particularly in the mountains of Algeria, as well as in Morocco, where you see the tirailleurs marocains, or the tirailleurs tunisiens, tirailleurs Morocco and Tunisia, where their own leaders will offer a certain amount of soldiers who might have volunteered for their leader, might have been soldiers for their leader already, to serve in the tirailleurs. Once war is declared, conscription, which had existed in certain parts of the Muslim communities in North Africa, is rapidly expanded and treated similarly to the rest of metropolitan France. So you do get soldiers who now are serving, drafted, conscripted for the war. The Zouaves and those other professional soldiers are either doing their mandatory 3 years of service. If you are of European descent, living in Algiers, one of the Pied Noir community, which are the French settler community in North Africa, you're most likely serving in a Zouave regiment. That is, if you get drafted, like over 75% of other people into the infantry. But you also have the opportunity in France to volunteer for service in the Zouaves and in all of these other professional units. So you do see a lot of native-born soldiers, and as we just talked about, there are reserve battalions in France. You also have cavalry, which would be the chasseurs d'Afrique if you are of European descent, and the Spahi if you are native descent, and similar structure and recruitment and training to cavalry in France, and in terms of the Zouaves and tirailleurs to how they are recruited and for what reason. The one major outlier in this that is part of the Army of Afrique is probably, maybe outside of the Zouaves, and maybe this might be a good poll, is which of these two units have you heard about and know more about, is a unit that actually still exists in the French army, and that is the Légion étrangère, the Foreign Legion, is part of the Army of Africa. They are stationed in Algeria, and they will be until Algeria gains its independence. And as the name implies, these are the foreign volunteers, led by French officers, but soldiers from all over the world, still very much the ethos of no questions asked, who are serving alongside the Zouaves and the tirailleurs in a lot of these campaigns all over the world, but part of the Army of Africa at this time. So their recruitment, of course, voluntary, people showing up from all over the world. This is the height of that swashbuckling era of, campaigns in the sands of the Sahara and in the mountains of Algeria. So they themselves, a volunteer group. But as we'll see, the makeup of all these units will change drastically once we enter the war itself.
It brings me on to really, I suppose, the next thing that's in my mind. And this is about how you take this, or in a way, a sort of colonial spearhead force, the force that goes everywhere, does everything, fights everybody, in any sort of climatic conditions, in any geographical conditions, not dissimilar in some ways to the experience of the pre-1914 British Army. And then you take it and you throw it into the Western Front. And of course, the Western Front is a completely different experience. Every single army that comes to the Western Front has to go through a pretty brutal learning curve, whether it's the British, the Indian Army, whether it's the American Army, whether later it's the Eastern Front Army of Germany that comes to the Western Front. That has a brutal learning curve in 1918 too. So it's a unique crucible. And one thing that I'm really interested in is, so you mentioned there's already some Army of Africa units in France right at the start of 1914. Obviously, more units begin to arrive fairly rapidly. And one thing I'm mind of, just in preparation for this episode, I dug through my postcard collection. Regular listeners know I collect First World War postcards. And I found one that was actually a French one celebrating the Battle of the Marne. And there's various armies portrayed in it. The French army, the British army, the Belgian army are all sweeping away the Germans with brooms. But appearing at the bottom of this picture is, at first I was like, well, what is that? And I realized it was a representation of the French colonial soldiers beginning to arrive. And they're arriving and they're looking very ferocious and they're going to really stick it to the Germans, as so the postcard implies. But I suppose the question I'm driving at here is they arrive, of course, in larger numbers as the campaign continues. And what do North African soldiers experience as they enter the front lines and indeed the France in general in 1914? And what are some of the barriers they're going to experience? Because we've talked a little bit in the round about the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, and how hard the British really worked to try and make sure that the army is fed properly, has access to religious rights, burial rights, and so on. But it's still a culture shock. So what's it like in the the Army of Africa for North African soldiers? How do they experience the climate? How do they deal with it moving into a very different type of war? How do they deal with religious observance and food?
So I will say, and we are separating here, the Muslim soldiers, the indigenous soldiers, as it would apply. For most of the Zouaves, even those Zouaves coming from Algeria or the Chasseurs d'Afrique, it's not a major adjustment. Many of them might have been born in France or have lived in France in some time and are thrown right into the action, to the point that you see them at the Battle of the Frontiers taking part. And that postcard that you have documenting the arrival of the indigenous groups is, telling. There is a lot of pride in France for its empire. It's a prestige reason. There, we've talked about this before. Why does France have an empire? So these soldiers will be entering a world that is different, completely different to a lot of them. The tirailleurs and their practice of Islam, it is interesting that these units are equipped in division where there is a mix of both soldiers. There's not a division, even if you look at the names of some of these divisions, like the Moroccan division, that is composed completely of indigenous troops or completely of the troops of European descent in the Army of Africa. So they're constantly mixed. They will have chaplains of the Christian faith attached to many of these Muslim units, which I think is interesting. And they're predominantly serving the officers and non-commissioned officers of these units. But there is an acceptance of their own religious practices. There's great photographs of these guys at prayer on the Western Front, doing the traditional Muslim call to prayer and then the actual prayers themselves. There's also really great instances of them on various Muslim holidays and unit holidays where they have traditional foods. Like there's a great photo of the Moroccan division commemorating the Second Battle of Artois and their storming of Vimy Ridge, where they've got lamb and couscous and traditional North African dances, and they're playing games. And what is also fascinating about these photos is you see a mix of European and North African troops together celebrating. There's a little bit more integration in the French Army of Africa than there is in the British Indian Army, where you will see enlisted European and enlisted indigenous soldiers serving together in the same squad. So you see that commemorated. And of course, with burial rites, this is something that is discussed at the time. You have a small Muslim community in Paris, the Grand Mosque of Paris. If you ever get a chance to go and visit today, fantastic museum. And talks about how their beginnings as a site for religion and worship for Muslim troops of the French army in the First World War. And great collection of Muslim troops in the First World War if you go into the museum as well. It's called the Grand Mosque of Paris. Absolutely fantastic spot to visit. Great museum. And so the French government is documenting, and the French army is noting, wow, wait, we have all of these soldiers here. Really for the first time. Many had come during the Franco-Prussian War, but not in these kinds of numbers. And a lot of those were captured very quickly, unfortunately, for the French army. But in the Franco-Prussian War. So now you start to have to get the logistics of accommodating their worship, accommodating their burial. And the French army is taking steps. Do they do enough? No. Does the British army do enough for the Indian soldiers? Probably not. But they are making attempts. They are making efforts. And it just goes to show that when you visit a military cemetery today, like Verdun, there are clearly delineated Muslim graves. And I'm not sure. I think we actually talked about this last week, too. I can't remember if there is a British example, but at least in the French army, they try their best to make sure the graves face Mecca, which is both a period burial technique and then in the modern French cemeteries as well. So there is a cultural awareness and an attempt, mainly from pressure from Muslim leaders in North Africa and in France, to accommodate. It's not something that's ever completely achieved, but it is understood that you need to accommodate these soldiers and their ways of worship.
That's a really interesting point because it does echo the strict efforts in the British Indian Army to try and do that as well. I think that we have to be a little bit careful that on one hand we might look at this and go, in the 21st century eyes, how liberal, how enlightened in the wider context of racism and scientific racism as it's described at the time. And on the other hand, there's also just the question of military efficiency. If you don't honor these practices, there's a high likelihood at best you're going to get low morale, at worst you're going to get a mutiny, you're going to get a serious reaction to it. So there's complex elements to this, but it is interesting the levels that are put into this. And just on racism, and particularly racism within the context of the early 20th century. When I was going through my postcards collection, not that I deliberately seek out postcards like this, but you pick them up in various sales and things. One thing that the Germans do very quickly through 1914 is start to portray really appalling caricatures of French colonial troops and the British Indian Army as well. And the French colonial troops are usually portrayed as the most barbaric savages that you can imagine. They're taking ears, they're inflicting terrible casualties, and they're often contrasted in German propaganda images as these sort of small, hunched, savage-looking characters with lots of knives and blades, with very stereotypical features, contrasted against stoic, square-jawed, broad-chested German soldiers. And there are German postcards and art produced that mocks both the French colonials and the British Indian Army in this way, which does give some impression about, in the wider context of European views in the 20th century, it's absolutely acceptable to be this virulently aggressive towards the colonial troops of the Entente. But one thing I think that perhaps encourages that, certainly in its portrayal of the French colonial troops, James, is that the units like the Moroccan Division and so on start to gain a really formidable assault mythos. They get a reputation. Perhaps they already have it. We've discussed this. They're already known as hard fighters around the empire. But what's interesting to me is, and in slight contrast to the Indian Army, which has a really tough time in 1915, the French Army of Africa gets this reputation as shock troops very early on in 1914 and 1915. And how does it develop this reputation? Is it a mixture of what they've done before, Is it more about what they achieve on the Western Front? Where does that balance lie?
So I think it's one of those things, again, that you come in and to the First World War in 1914, and these are famous units that you might have read about already if you study military history. So you know who these guys are. You know their reputation. They're colorful. I mean, pick up any illustrated book on military history from the late 19th, early 20th century, and there are photos and paintings of Zouaves in there. They just look cool. They look colorful. They stand out. So they had that reputation coming in. And of course, they also do perform very, very well on the Western Front. And through the war, they are considered very highly reliable troops, both the tirailleurs, the Zouaves, and their cavalry arm, as well as the Legion. So they do develop into this really shock formation. The Moroccan division, which you highlighted, is a really great example. Not actually soldiers from Morocco, it should be pointed out. These are soldiers who are stationed in Morocco when World War I begins and are recalled and formed into a division. As we talked about, Morocco is a French protectorate in 1914. There had been pretty bad violence as a result of the multiple affairs which Britain and Germany are dragged into in the years leading up to the First World War. So these are predominantly regular soldiers. These are professional soldiers serving in French protected Morocco. So a large proportion of these guys are European, it should be noted, because you have all these Zouave battalions. You also have the Foreign Legion serving in this division. And they do serve as this shock group. And it's a weird mix of guys, especially in the spring of 1915 when they're fighting at Artois. I think one of the most quintessential monuments of the First World War on the Western Front is the Moroccan Division's monument on Vimy Ridge, because it's in the parking lot and people go, oh, that's kind of weird. And then you go see the big Canadian memorial, right? But so people don't understand the fighting that the French do, which we've covered in 1915 to take Vimy Ridge, to try to hold Vimy Ridge. And the Moroccan division is one of these key elite divisions that actually makes it to the top of Vimy Ridge. Unfortunately, they can't hold on to it. They haven't figured out how to respond to German counterattacks yet and how to have proper reserves. And they take horrible casualties in this fighting. But the fact that they're able to get to the top of this ridge, the fact that these soldiers are able to make a stand, to achieve a small, if only a few hours long victory, highlights their importance in the French army and helps promote the French army's professionalism and helps promote their esprit de corps, as well as continuing on that tradition that the French have pushed of these soldiers being their elite troops. Look at how the world, even though it's a large part of the world that France has conquered, look at how the world has come in this fighting for France. You see these elite units going forward, and I think also you've got a really great representation of the rest of the French army and some of the key highlights that stand out to us in the English-speaking world serving among the Moroccan division. So for a lot of those soldiers that are serving, say, in the Foreign Legion, of course, you have the traditional kind of rough and tumble recruits. You've also got a large portion of Armenian refugees. There's a whole company of Armenians serving in the Foreign Legion at this time. Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, Czech soldiers, and there's a monument to the Czech in the Foreign Legion at Vimy Ridge, just south of, or just below the ridge itself, I should say. You've also got a lot of blue-blooded Americans who happen to be studying in Paris serving in the Foreign Legion at this time. Many of them do not like that they're in the Foreign Legion. They wanted to join the French regular army, and they were told, well, you're not French, so you can join the Foreign Legion. And they will end up leaving the Foreign Legion after this to form the Lafayette Flying Corps, so which becomes known as the Lafayette Escadrille. So there are a weird mix of guys. Then, of course, you have the Zouaves and tirailleurs who they had been serving with as well. And these are aggressive units. It could be said that these guys, many of whom by this point are veterans, either of the campaigns in North Africa, but also of the fighting in France and Flanders by this point, are incredibly aggressive. And once they take those first few lines of German trenches, they're going to keep pushing on until they physically can't anymore. And they do. Unfortunately for them, they haven't learned that you need to retain some of that strength to stop whatever the Germans throw back at you. It should also be noted that around this time in 1915, there are other actions that the Army of Africa takes part in and becomes a centerpiece in that I think highlight World War I in general. One of the biggest misconceptions, I think, of France in World War I on a very, very basic level is April 1915 and the Second Battle of Ypres. And a lot of confusion over exactly who these guys are that are hit by this first German gas attack that the Canadians and the British come in to assist with repelling the German assault, which follows. It's an Algerian division. It is these Army of Africa soldiers, but these soldiers are predominantly French. There's a lot of Zouaves, some tirailleurs in there as well. But another one of these units that is standing and fighting and dying facing this first German gas attack in April 1915. And just to kind of show how confusing the French army is and misunderstandings of it, read British and Canadian accounts of seeing these guys coming back from this gas attack or standing and fighting against the German assault. And they don't really know what to call them. You see them, it's a French division. It's an Algerian division. These soldiers are all from North Africa. Oh, wait, these soldiers are French. It just goes to show how confusing this topic all is.
Just about that memorial in the car parking lot at Vimy Ridge or right next to it, because it in some ways it's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating action. When it takes place on the 9th of May 1915, at the same time, the British and the Indians are attacking at Ober's Ridge and are having proportionately one of the worst days the British and Empire Army has on the Western Front. A total disaster. Whereas down on Vimy Ridge, of course, the French very nearly stormed Vimy Ridge in 1915, come very close to it. And it's quite sad that the last time I was there with that memorial, which must have been about a decade ago, it was pretty dilapidated. It was in need of some tender loving care. And as you say, James, people get out of the coach and go, that's sort of strange, a little French memorial, and then they walk and go and obviously see the much more dominating Canadian memorial. But the fact that they're able to do this, and I'm glad you sort of emphasised this intense, almost reckless aggression that they show in the assault on Vimy Ridge, which in some ways is their undoing, and that's partially just the nature of Allied tactics in 1915. It's partially the nature of the battlefield. They take such casualties storming it, and then they can't hold on against the inevitable German counterattacks. But it does embed an image of them as these elite, ferocious shock troops. And it reminds me of what we were talking about a few weeks ago about elite divisions and what makes an elite division. Whole host of things. Armies still study to this day. How do we make troops elite? How do we make them feel elite? And the short answer is, well, we don't really know, but culture plays a role. The idea that soldiers think themselves elite plays a role. Training plays a role. Luck plays a role, because if you get completely smashed in all your battles, even if it's not your fault, generally don't become elite. But it's interesting that the French Army of Africa retains this, because even though the battle at Vimy Ridge ultimately ends in a French repulse, it's still a pretty remarkable and extremely bloody fight that actually cements the reputation of them as this ferocious shock force, that if you really want to pierce the German front, you're going to look to these troops because they've got the aggression and the intensity to do it. But, James, and we were talking about this before the camera started rolling, before we started recording, there is, of course, another element to the Army of Africa, and that is not necessarily doing anywhere near as much on the Western Front in 14 and 15 as their more famed compatriots. And this is the cavalry of the Army of Africa. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because you were talking before the camera started and you were talking about how interesting you find this. And we have covered cavalry in 1915 and 16 previously on earlier episodes, but we didn't cover French cavalry. So tell me, James, while the Zouaves and the tirailleurs are attacking ferociously and going into action, what's the cavalry branch of the Army of Africa doing on the Western Front in 1915?
So you see both the Chasseurs d'Afrique as well as the Spahis deployed to the Western Front. A lot of times they are going to be, those support squadrons that you see assigned to various infantry divisions, just like in the British Army. But then you also have really interesting actions that they take out. In 1914, the Chasseurs d'Afrique and the Spahis are engaged fighting German cavalry. They are engaged in the traditional cavalry role, scouting, covering the front for the Colonial Army Corps and for the Army of Africa, the 19th Corps, as they move forward. But then what I think is really, really interesting as we get into the late war is a specific action that, as you hinted, takes us away from the Western Front and takes us to the Salonika Front, the oft-forgotten and misunderstood stepchild of First World War fronts. In 1918, as the Allied armies are advancing out of Salonika, including a lot of soldiers from the French colonial army and the Army of Africa, pushing the Bulgarians and the Austrians and the Germans further north in the fall of 1918. You see this amazing raid carried out by Chasseurs d'Afrique and Spahi units going hundreds, I believe hundreds, I have to double check this number of kilometers behind German lines and actually cutting off German and Bulgarian retreat routes through occupied Serbia and into, as they're trying to move into Bulgaria, moving into Hungary and Austria, pulling back from the front. It's known as the Raid of Uksub, which is in Serbia. I believe the town is pronounced differently in English, but it just goes to show my interest that I know the French pronunciation of the town. And it is one of these often overlooked episodes of the war. This great cavalry raid, kind of in the tradition of a Western epic, of the cavalry going all the, not to quote General Horrocks from the movie A Bridge Too Far, but the cavalry riding all the way, coming in at just the right moment. But that's what it is. And it comes down to a lot of soldiers who may have experienced something similar in Algeria in the years prior to the First World War. But really, these are new soldiers who are experiencing a cavalry raid a la the 19th century, and incredibly successful, to the point that one of the recent graduating classes of the French Military Academy, a Saint-Cyr, they always have to claim a battle or a leader as their nickname or title. And within the past 10 years, there was a class of Uksub documenting that this intense cavalry raid that even British officers who are hearing about it don't believe is truly possible. It is an over-the-top and deserves its own complete full episode raid. So these guys are very heavily involved in the war as well, and they get a few more opportunities than their comrades on the Western Front to carry out these tactics and carry out traditional cavalry hit and run, raid, go behind enemy lines, something to really write home in the newspapers about.
That raid through Bulgaria to cut off the retreat of the Bulgarian with their allies, some German units still there, some Austro-Hungarian units still there. That breakthrough is absolutely spectacular. In fact, it's so spectacular and so spectacularly carried out that in the 1920s, when there's a big debate in the British military about, well, cavalry has really probably had its day, we're going to have to mechanize, which eventually the cavalry do. But one thing that is brought up frequently is how decisive this French intervention is, because it's, and there's certainly some truth in this, it's not just a sort of, ride to glory, it's not just a stunt. This really, really unhinges the Bulgarian army and its allies, because the Bulgarians are being driven back. They've got problems, economic problems within Bulgaria. Obviously, their allies are in disarray too. This is late 1918. But there's plenty of defensible positions. If you're attacking Bulgaria from the south, it's very, very difficult. It's not good terrain to attack through. You're much better to attack it from the west or the north. Obviously, the allies can't really do that. And so the Bulgarian plan is to try and okay, they're being driven back from their mountain defenses, but there's plenty of other defensive lines. Get into those, dig in, and try and wait it out, see what happens. And the French cavalry breakthrough, this raid, this, I suppose you might call it a deep battle, a deep operation, completely wrecks that. They basically shatter the logistics system. They're riding around, they're causing havoc, they overwhelm isolated garrisons with relative ease. The Bulgarians and the Germans can't deal with them. And it has a massive effect because it breaks open the Bulgarian defenses. There's no prospect of them holding on. They're getting outflanked everywhere. And it is seen as an exemplar of, well, this is what cavalry aggressively handled can do. And the fact that it's French Army of Africa cavalry as well, that they have not had this opportunity until late 1918, is considered exciting enough that the British cavalry studied it in the 1920s, which again just shows that the impact they have.
And for anyone who wants to look it up, it is called the Maneuver of Uskub. Absolutely fascinating. I should correct myself from earlier. It's 80 kilometers. And I would say, I would use the excuse of saying, I was thinking in miles because I'm an American, but there's less. It's only like 40 miles. So it's just a brief correction to myself from earlier. But yeah, it is really, really interesting, and it carries on. And I think there would be a really interesting comparison, as we were also talking before we started recorded. Again, anyone who wants to do a PhD, this is a great one. French cavalry, but specifically the Army of Africa cavalry, and French cavalry operating in Salonika as compared to the British cavalry operating in Egypt and Palestine. Really, gosh, doesn't this sound a little bit like Beersheba on a grander scale? Really, really interesting.
So we'll have to get you back at some point, James, to talk about French cavalry operating out in other fronts. But we need to get back to the Western Front because, of course, we've we had a little detour there after 1915. But of course, the French Army of Africa continues to fight through 16. And one thing that strikes me is, and we discussed this when we looked at the French Army in 1915 with you previously, is what a bloody awful period. Really, 1914 to 1916 is for the French army. Such heavy casualties, such relentless grinding attrition. And one thing that is definitely on my mind, I'm interested in your thoughts on, is how does the Army of Africa maintain its culture and its identity, given that it's taking such bruising casualties through 14 to 16? And how does it maintain its traditions? How does it maintain its standards when the attrition rate is so enormous?
Yeah, and you do see, obviously, as attrition is popping up, getting worse, you see French units beginning to receive recruits that might not have any attachment to North Africa and also might not be volunteers, conscripts coming from all over. There's a great diary of a soldier in the Zouaves that's called a Breton in the Zouaves, at home in the Zouaves. So a mix of guys. And you will, of course, also see conscripts ending up in the tirailleurs from metropolitan France, who have maybe not requested to be there. So there is this increasing dilution of what the Army of Africa's traditional recruits are. But in the same way, I would say that, Highland regiments of the British Army maintain that distinct regimental tradition, that regimental culture, even as the majority of the Gordon Highlanders end up no longer coming from Aberdeen and are now all from the East End of London. You see a pride in that unit. You see an adoption of that unit's cultures, that tradition, and that history. And the same thing happens in the French Army of Africa. I mean, it's a cool unit to be a part of with a lot of great history. If I'm a military history nerd and I get called up and I have the opportunity to go to a unit that has Alma on as a battle honor on its flag, I think that's pretty cool. And there's a similar feeling in the French Army. They promote through these regimental days. And I'll make sure to send photos to post on the Dugout of that Moroccan celebration. I believe it's 2 years after the Second Battle of Artois and the assault on Vimy Ridge, where they promote, North African traditional food, activities, regimental spirit de corps, their previous fights. So it continues, and there's pride because they're the ones being reported about in the newspapers. The soldiers who retake Douaumont are a mix of soldiers from the colonial army and the Army of Africa, specifically tirailleurs and Zouaves. There starts to be a mix, which they creatively call battalions mixed, mixed battalions of Zouaves and tirailleurs as casualties rise. And they also look at how best to utilize the strengths of both troops. Some racism, some inclusion of, can we trust the tirailleurs completely on their own? So you will occasionally see this horrible long acronym that freaks me out as a native English speaker every time I see it, which is RMZT. That is Regiment Mixed of Zouaves and Tirailleurs. And that is basically taking 3 or 4 battalions, some of the battalions from the Zouaves, some of the battalions from the Tirailleurs, and mixing them to form one regiment. So that you start to see amalgamations as well. It is a interesting time in developing, but these guys, as I said, are still being the ones reported on by the newspapers. They look cool. There's a great American cartoon from a soldier in the 1st Division from the Second Battle of the Marne in 1918, where an officer is stopping one of the doughboys from firing at this group of Zouaves and tirailleurs on top of a hill. And the officer is saying, "What are you doing? You're shooting at Moroccans." And the soldier says, "Oh, I thought they were Turks. Aren't they on the side of the Germans?" And so there's this exoticism that around the world is still appealing to people, whether they're in the military or not. It stands out. So that strong regimental spirit de corps continues to the point that these units have lower rates of disobedience during the 1917 French Army mutinies than metropolitan French units do.
That's interesting too, that the uniforms stay so distinctive, because there's obviously pressures. The French army's uniforms evolve through the First World War, so do all armies to an extent. But to what extent do the uniforms remain distinctive? You know, if you saw men of the Army of Africa in 1914 and put them side by side with men in 1918, what are the key changes we might see? Or do they still retain a distinctive color pattern, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take the most colorful and probably the best known. That's the Zouaves. They wear those dark blue, what are called boleros, and vests, generally with tombeau, which is the flourishes on the front of the chest, and then they would be colored differently depending on what regiment you were in. And Sarouel, which are the big baggy trousers, and Chechia, which are the fezzes worn at the back. So very much standing out, bright white canvas Sarouel in the summer and dark red cactus wool Sarouel in the winter. And so they're wearing that when they go to fight in 1914. Beginning in 1915, the Army of Africa begins to receive instructions to switch over to wool, what they call khaki moutard, which you'll never guess what translates in English. It's mustard khaki. And there's a few different reasons why they think it is called mustard khaki. One is it is like British Army khaki, but it has a yellow hint to it. It has a yellowish hue to it. And if you look at the fibers, there's some yellow in there. Another rumor that I've heard, I've never actually seen it substantiated in a principal account, is one of the main manufacturers for this wool is in Dijon. So where Dijon mustard is from. So I think it's more about the color. But so you start to see these soldiers switching into this uniform and adding French horizon blue when needed. But by the end of 1915, early 1916, these guys are almost completely in this khaki moutard, something that the French colonial army will go to as well, both on the Western Front and serving in the Dardanelles or in Salonika. They maintain that cut of the uniform, though. So in 1915, 1916, you'll see Zouaves or tirailleurs who are clearly not in those bright blue and red uniforms, sky blue for the tirailleurs, dark blue for the Zouaves. But they still have capotes because now they're fighting on the Western Front and it's much colder. But they have those baggy trousers, the Sarouel. They continue to issue those. But they slowly but surely shrink as the war goes on, to the point that when you see photos of these guys in 1917, during the Chemin des Dames offensive, for the second battle of Verdun, and 1918, if you're just looking at their silhouette, they look no different than any other French soldier. They maintain the khaki moutard, so different color. If you see them in color photographs, they are clearly different than the rest of the French army. And on their helmets, they'll have a crescent versus the flaming bomb with RF for République Française, or the horn for the chasseur. They maintain this half moon symbol of the Army of Africa on their helmets. But outside of that, you would not be able to tell the difference by 1918. If you're looking at them on a dark night or just see their backs, yeah, they're wearing khaki. Some French metropolitan regiments are starting to get that too. They have lost that identity. Now, they will maintain it out of the line. Great photos of these guys in 1918 who still have their boleros and chechias for when they're not in the line, to maintain that esprit de corps, that regimental identity. But it is slowly but surely evaporating in the front line itself. As soon as the war ends, though, they come right back out. And it does look cool. And having worn this stuff before, it's way more comfortable than a regular French uniform.
Well, comfort is always an important consideration in any war, but especially the First World War. Just a point to sort of really emphasize, I think, there is that the Army of Africa is in the line from 1914. It's still in the line in 1918, but it's evolved as it's gone through. And that description of their changing uniform, really important. And if we were to, listeners, if you're interested in how do they where they fight change, I invite you to go back to our episodes we did together, James, and listen to the discussion of the French Army in 1918 that we did some episodes ago. But as we're sort of coming to the end of this discussion, it strikes me there's still so much more to cover. We may revisit this in the future, but one thing that is on my mind, and we touched on this last week when we talked about the French colonial army, is how does this experience in the First World War feed into post-war politics in North Africa? Because, of course, post-war politics in Algeria are going to be, certainly after the Second World War, absolutely definitive to the history of France. But decades before that war, what happens? Is there any sort of are there any changes politically as a result of the service of the Army of Africa? Does it fire up nationalist movements in any way? Are there any controversies? Tell us a little bit about what happens when these men go home.
Absolutely. So, like the rest of the world, the First World War has a drastic impact on French North Africa. You see the beginnings of what will become the independence movements in a new form. There had always been independence movements in these countries since the French conquest in the 19th century. But the modern form of it and what becomes modern Algeria, modern Tunisia, modern Morocco comes out of the experience of the First World War. A lot of these veterans returning home, demanding better treatment. There are, again, massacres, riots, sometimes perpetrated by tirailleurs when they return home, sometimes perpetrated against tirailleurs or the Muslim communities in Algeria. There's always this distrust between the European settler community and the indigenous population in these countries, and it continues on. You see veterans groups interact with one another, broadly speaking, but that tends to be those tirailleurs and the members of the Muslim community who view themselves as French as well as Algerian. But with the feeling with many of these soldiers coming home having experienced the war, just like many other geographic or regions or ethnic groups all over the world, feeling as though they had been treated like cannon fodder during the war, you see that those myths and those debates and then sometimes those facts starting to appear. You begin to see this development of a independence movement and of an anti-French movement and of a movement of give us more rights. Look at our service during the war. But it is absolutely there. Tensions remain high, and it will explode in the aftermath of the Second World War. But it's beginning to rumble there. Should be noted there are still French military cemeteries and monuments to these soldiers in North Africa, as well as increasingly in France, as Algerian diaspora spreads throughout France. There's monuments specifically to the Zouaves, and the Zouaves remain a very controversial part of French history. Should be noted, I think if you looked at Zouaves in the news in the past 10 years, you'll see there's several far-right groups that name themselves the Zouaves, and it's tied into the Pied Noir community in France and remembrance of French colonialism in Algeria. And at the same time, you also see an increasing remembrance, similarly to what we talked about with the colonial army and the tirailleurs sénégalais, for the tirailleurs algériens and their service in both world wars. So you are seeing monuments go up to the Algerian soldiers, the indigenous Algerian soldiers on the Western Front and beyond, as an increased understanding of their participation grows in the French world and in the English-speaking world. So it's a complicated history and shows the connection of the Army of Africa to contemporary French politics and to modern French politics. So just like all of this history that is controversial, there is a dark side to it as well as the light side to it. It remains very poignant in French public discourse.
Well, James, you've really got across what a fascinating, complex, and it continued to be felt story that this is. And you've given us a great overview of the Army of Africa. And it's a subject that I feel there's still so much more to discuss with you. I'm sure it's one that we'll revisit in the future. And listeners, I hope you found it equally interesting. And if you'd like to comment on this episode and perhaps pose 1 or 2 questions, or if there's something that you'd like covered further, I'd invite you to check out our Fourth Wall site, the Dugout, which you can find the details of in the show notes, where there is an opportunity to comment on episodes, and it's one where we'll definitely be able to see those. But James, otherwise, thank you so much for your input, your inspiration on this. I was going to end with a final question, really, and this is for particularly our English-speaking listeners, which are the majority, are there any particular books you might recommend on the Army of Africa?
Yeah, so there are a few books that I think really speak out. Unfortunately, all of them are in French. I think there is a large misunderstanding because of the myth of the Army of Africa, of the legend of how great these guys were, that you see a lot of those myths perpetuated. But for English-speaking listeners, there is one diary that was translated of a Zouave into English, and I will make sure to send a citation for that to the Dugout. The name is escaping me right now, unfortunately. I believe it's called a Zouave's Journal, but I'll have to go back and double-check that. And, of course, if you explore Elizabeth Greenhall's book on the French Army in the Great War, the Cambridge volumes goes into detail about the Army of Africa and their use not only on the Western Front, but across the world as well. It should also be noted there are a lot of interesting books on them from the history of the American Civil War, if you want to know about that earlier time period. I will say a lot of them, though, as an American and as someone passionate and who has worked in the American Civil War, are, again, very mythological. And a lot of understanding of what they did and what they meant to soldiers in the American Civil War, but not what it means in France and what it means to the Army of Africa and to military history more broadly. So I'll make sure to upload a list of a few good, some reads from throughout history on these guys to the Dugout, and then check out his Zouave's Journal, his Zouave's Diary in the meantime.
Well, thank you, James. And listeners, do check that out on the Dugout if you're interested, and I hope you certainly are. And James, thanks again for all your input, and look forward to continuing this discussion with you in the not too distant future.
Absolutely, anytime.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
A mega list, in fact, of questions that we occasionally pose to James in French Q&A episodes that we record. I'll just do that a bit again. Sorry. We nearly made it to the entire episode without a stumble, but Hunter, Linus, if you can cut that bit, we'll do it from the top.